Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and I'd like you to do me a favour, guys. Close your eyes and think back to your worst experience with online dating, the most excruciating Hinge disaster or Tinder catastrophe that you've been through. However bad you think that ordeal was, I promise you it's nothing on the jaw-dropping tale told in I Love My Dad, a movie that's part cringe comedy, part family drama, and part horror movie for the MySpace generation. The film follows a screw-up father who's desperate to reconnect with the child he pushed away. Blocked on social media, this character, Chuck, played by Patton Oswalt, resorts to posing online as a beautiful young waitress whose friend request his estranged son will surely accept. The scheme is soon complicated, however, when the teenager begins to fall for the stranger in his DMs, growing determined to meet her in person. He's of course completely unaware that the person on the other end of his broadband connection isn't in fact a beautiful young waitress, it's his dad. Now, that premise, a teenager catfished by his own father, might sound like the logline for a zany, high-concept Hollywood romp, but what's so special about I Love My Dad is how grounded it is in the loneliness of being desperate for connection. The lure of the internet, the versions of ourselves that we present online, and the sometimes unhealthy fantasies that permits. These questions are all tenderly explored by the film's outrageously talented writer, director, and star, James Morosini, who it was a delight to chat with for this week's show. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, James explains how I Love My Dad has such an air of emotional truth to it because, well, this actually happened, to quote the film itself. There are ways in which James's story deviates from the one in the film, but yes, his father really did catfish him in real life in events that inspired his screenplay. We discuss age, sex, location, the title of James's first draft of the film, and why he opted against an early iteration of the movie that ended in Chuck having a heart attack and Franklin getting together with the real-life Becca, the young waitress that Chuck's been posing as. It's a fascinating conversation about the inherent performance of social media, how we're all catfishing each other to less explicit degrees, and why running towards the most vulnerable part of ourselves rather than running away makes for great storytelling. A huge thanks to James for being a great guest, and a massive thank you as ever to our Patreon community. If you like what we do and want to support the show, receiving exclusive bonus content in the process, patreon.com/scriptapart is the address for you. We've got some great guests coming up, and Patreon supporters will have the opportunity to put their questions forward to each and every one of them. So yeah, get involved, guys. That address again is patreon.com/scriptapart. We really do appreciate your support. Okay, that's enough out of me. Let's dive into the conversation. This is the brilliant James Morosini discussing the first draft secrets of I Love My Dad. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. James Morosini, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
It's going great, man. I'm happy to be here.
Glad to hear it. Well, James, we're chatting just over a year since the release of I Love My Dad, and I can imagine the ways that your life must have changed professionally in that time. Like, it's such a great advert for your work as a writer, a director, and an actor. It was so warmly received. People continue to discover the movie. It must have opened a lot of doors for you in terms of your career. I can wrap my head around that. What is harder for me to imagine, and it's the place I wanted to begin our conversation today, is what the last 12 months must have been like for you personally post-making I Love My Dad. Like, this was a film that I understand your therapist encouraged you to make, having obviously worked through some of your feelings with them around this unusual real-life situation with your dad that formed the inspiration for the movie. Now we're a year down the line. Do you think you got out of I Love My Dad whatever it was your therapist was hoping for you to get out of it, like in terms of catharsis and perhaps even closure?
It's a really good question. I don't know if we ever really get closure around anything. I think we're just we become more open to explore things and ask questions that we maybe otherwise weren't willing to. The the idea of a father wanting to make sure his son is okay, so he's willing to do and go to any lengths to make sure of that. That's what I was interested in this movie, but I was also interested in this idea of what do you do when somebody has done something unforgivable to you? How do you wrap your head around that? And is there a way forward from that point? Um, and I thought that this was a useful context to explore that question. Um, and I do feel like after making this movie, I do feel like a more forgiving person in a lot of ways. I don't know. I do have a tendency to just try to understand another person's perspective, just because it makes going through the world easier and more fun when you're like, trying to understand why people are doing the things that they're doing. But but yeah, man, I mean, I think more than anything, this feeling of like when something really resonates with you, that's a good indicator that it will resonate with other people as well. I think making this film has just reinstilled my belief in that kind of basic principle of storytelling, that in order to move others, you need to move yourself first. And so I find myself kind of keep holding that as a target in all of my work.
That's really interesting. Obviously, the story is so unusual, James. Like it's not on paper a universal experience. Like being catfished by your dad is not a commonplace thing. But people have really connected emotionally with "I Love My Dad." You know, they found something in the material that's made them contemplate their relationships with the internet, with social media, and even members of their own family. Did you anticipate that as you wrote the film? Was there a sense that maybe the tale being told in this movie was a blown up version of familial relationships that a lot of people have had to navigate, or feelings that people are navigating around, their online existences?
I think all of us have complicated family dynamics, whether or not our parents have created a fake account to try to make sure we're okay. Doesn't really matter. I mean, I guess I'm interested in the parent-child relationship because I think it represents kind of an early model that we all have for what intimacy looks like, and is the model we kind of use going forward out into the world after that. So I'm always interesting. I'm always interested in exploring that relationship because I think it's often reflected throughout the rest of our lives. Um, I am a believer that if you take somebody's worst moments and make a reel of those worst moments, they look like a terrible person. And if you take somebody's best moments, they look like a saint. And so I wanted to look at some really difficult to understand behavior, like someone creating an account to catfish their son, and then kind of build the argument for that behavior in the wrong direction. Because when we do something wrong, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's kind of you can track the thinking and the reasons for why you're doing a thing you may even know is wrong. And I find those are my favorite films, where you're seeing why somebody does the wrong thing and you're really building the case for why they should do that. That there's really no other way for them to do it. Um, and yeah, man, I mean, I think a lot of us, we all have problems with our family in some way or another, but I think we all have a lot of shame around talking about these things openly. When they're happening to us, it can feel like we're the only ones that are going through it. And so I guess I'm a big believer in trying to express these feelings as much as possible and kind of be open about them.
That's really beautiful. And there was something you said earlier about like this film making you a more forgiving person. When I tell people, the log line of this film, and then I tell them you won't believe how much your empathy lies with the dad, and you totally track why he did the things he did. People are like, really? And then they go away and watch the film, and then they're like, wow, yeah, the compassion that you extend towards Chuck in this film, and by virtue, by extension, your dad, it's pretty remarkable. When you talk about the film having made you more forgiving and the process of writing it having made you more forgiving, was it kind of an iterative process, like finding that forgiveness on the page, like the empathy that you extend towards Chuck in this? Was there was that something you kind of had to work towards and discover in drafts, or was the intention always to set out to make a movie that kind of did kind of take this behavior that on paper seems kind of crazy, but actually, like, when you look at it up close and you understand the reasoning, it's like you kind of can't help but root for them?
Yeah, I think it was a constant balancing act of making Chuck's behavior it couldn't be so horrible that that we can't get behind him as the lead of the movie. So where this came down was like, what did Chuck do to Franklin that made Franklin push him away in the first place? And we had a lot of conversations about this around, should it be one specific thing, or should it be kind of just a general series of disappointments that are just tangled and so difficult to unpack that it's more of just a general feeling overall? And I leaned in that direction because I think if it was a specific thing that Chuck did to Franklin, it would make us feel like Franklin was maybe being petty, that he wasn't willing to forgive Franklin, that Franklin was not willing to forgive Chuck for that one thing. And it would kind of feel like, well, they should just sit down and have a conversation about this one thing, and then, that'll be the end of it. But it felt more honest to these kind of long relationships, in that it's rarely just one thing. It's like, it's one thing after another that compound, and then our reactions to them compound. And the difficulty of these intimate relationships is that they're so complicated, and they've taken place over so many years that they're almost impossible to unpack. So at a certain point, you kind of have to just be like, it is what it is, and I'm going to just accept you as you are, and we're never going to get to the root of it. But yeah, I needed to show, because whether or not I forgive my actual dad doesn't really matter to an audience that doesn't know me. I mean, if I do forgive him, great, but that my job as a filmmaker is to walk an audience through a story, and to make them understand, and not necessarily understand, but feel each step of that story. So I needed to show that Chuck was estranged. And I needed to show that he is making his best possible effort to contact Franklin, and that none of these efforts are working. And then I need to show how he gets this idea, and why he's willing to go down that path. And I need to have him do it in a way where he's questioning his own behavior throughout. Because I think if any of us were to catfish another person, let alone our own child, we would be we'd feel real weird about it. And so it was important to me that he's falling further and further into this behavior. And I also needed to show that Franklin was exercising at least some discretion around who this person is, but is ultimately so lonely that he's willing to go along with it, and is willing to kind of, he seems like willfully naive in a way, because he's so desperate for human connection in this case.
That does sound like a really careful balancing act, and a real tightrope walk to kind of pull off. To zoom out a little bit, I think this was not the first film of yours that kind of introduced me to your work. Like I remember prior to I Love My Dad, I watched your debut feature, Three Something. I remember you describing that film as a tale in which fantasy meets the hard road of reality, and that description kind of applies to I Love My Dad too. So yeah, I guess I'd be curious to know, James, like why that gap between the way things are versus the way your characters desire them to be, why that is something that you seem to enjoy exploring in your storytelling. Like, there's a particular feeling that I always get from watching stories like that where, the delusion has to crash at some point and it breeds a tension and a sense of inevitability and dread. Is it a tonal thing that is exciting to you, or yeah, what kind of pulls you into that story type?
I think I find myself struggling with that in my own life a lot. This idea of like how much better things could be, and the ways we're going to go about getting to those places, and how that often we often cling to these ideas and these fantasies as almost an anesthetic that numb us to how our lives are now. And so much of uh, the problems in our lives come out of us trying to be someone we're not so that we can be somewhere else than we currently are. And if we were to just be more okay in our current circumstances, we might actually be all right overall. Now, I don't know if that's always the case. Sometimes you do have to try to go to another place, but it's a paradox I'm really fascinated by, of like, do you accept your current circumstances, or do you try to change them? In Three Something, it's about friends that are like, we should have a threesome, it'll be awesome, and they're pedestaling this experience as being kind of the solution to their friendship and to them feeling stuck at this moment in their lives. And I think in I Love My Dad, it's like, all the characters are doing it in their own way. Chuck is like, if I just can have a relationship with my son, everything will be okay. And Franklin's thinking, if I can just have a relationship with this woman that I'm meeting online, everything will be okay. And yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I have like a definitive answer around it. It's more so that I just think we often use fantasy as a drug, really, as a way of as a way of making ourselves feel better, but that it gets in the way of us actually just being in our actual lives. And so I like narratives that kind of explore that and walk us through it.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing that's also really unique to this movie is like it's hard to describe to people who didn't grow up at a very particular time in the infancy of the internet, just how much like the internet blew open the idea of that fantasy. And basically, I wonder sometimes whether kind of like younger generations realize the degree to which I sound like an old man now. Younger generations, whether they realize, the way in which like catfishing in that time of like the infancy of the internet, when people convincingly claim, oh, my webcam's broken, it was kind of more feasible in a way that it isn't today. And I had friends who were catfished, and while it was never kind of the extent to the situation in I Love My Dad, there was something always quite like poignant about it, quite tragic, like both in the people doing the catfishing, who were people who wanted to live different lives using digital avatars to indulge that fantasy, that drug-like fantasy, as you described it. And of course, it's also tragic in the sense of like the people whose lives are disrupted by it. How much you contemplated that as you built the film, the degree to which like younger audiences would be able to understand when we talk about the fantasies that exist across multiple ways that people use the internet, but specific to this film, did you kind of have any conversations about how you were going to broach that and how like younger viewers may have to have it explained to them?
The thing I don't think has changed at all since the beginning of social media is this idea of us trying to represent ourselves in the most likable way possible. And so in a way, we're kind of all catfishing one another because we're putting together we're putting together this kind of photo book, this collection of like, here is why I'm an appealing person. And that's the version of ourselves that we're interacting with other people as, but that's not who we are. It's such an incomplete picture. And there's something inherently dishonest and also cringeworthy about this idea of us trying to get other people to buy in to this really kind of this surface level representation of who we are. And so that was really the thing that I needed to get audiences on board for more than anything else. I didn't want it to be like a period movie from the early 2000s. It was that part of it was more important to me than anything else. The feeling that Franklin is representing himself as this happy guy, and that Chuck is obviously representing himself as this attractive waitress in order to make sure his son is okay. But the realization, I think, that Franklin has at the end is that he too was engaging with the form of dishonesty, and so that can't be the thing that he just holds against his dad forever, because he's dishonest too in a way. And so yeah, man, I think I wanted to use that kind of inherent dishonesty that social media has as the vehicle for the film itself.
And that's been kind of a running preoccupation for you. I remember like a couple of years ago, you did this this proof of concept for a series you were working on called 6:35 p.m. PST. And the film, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it basically shows a kind of a busboy in a restaurant trying to get his colleague to accept his Facebook friend request in the middle of some sort of seismic, like alien event. There's some sort of invasion situation going on. And the Facebook friend request part is incredibly relatable. The alien invasion thing we haven't had yet, but we rarely ever see that depiction of the kind of awkwardness and the kind of discomforts around social media and the sort of hypocrisies of it, where it's such a like part of the fabric of our society now. We never really see it like acknowledged in films, or it seems like something we're still kind of getting around to. So yeah, can you talk me through your relationship with social media and why, the nuances of the platforms, the discomforts it offers, the deceptions it allows, why that's something that you do seem to enjoy tackling in your writing?
This idea of like sending a friend request, it's just so like funny and sad to me.
Yeah.
Because that's really what we're all doing in our actual lives anyway. We're like, but it's so vulnerable, this idea of like, will you be my friend? Do you like me? Do you think I'm cool? Like that's something we're all doing in some way or another, but we disguise it in so many ways. And there's something about social media that where it's not, it's undisguised. It's just like, I'm going to request for this person to be my friend. And it's just, I don't know. There's something like, there's like a weird, there's like a weird nakedness to that in terms of just like how that's what we're doing in so many of our actual interactions. But I feel like as social media has developed, that's become more and more dressed up. This idea of like, I'm sending you a friend request now. It's like follow. It's gotten a little more coded, but I think the foundation of it is still there. Is like this feeling of all of us just really wanting to be seen and accepted for who we are, and but that we all seem to be so uncomfortable with the idea that that's what we're actually all trying to do, and that's what's driving so much of our behavior in the world. Yeah, I don't know. There's a part of your question earlier that I wanted to kind of get back to, this idea of like, of dishonesty and how we represent ourselves, and fantasy versus reality. It's like we're often so willing to feel however we feel at any given time that we try to do so many things just so we don't feel our feelings. And I think that a lot of the stories I am interested in kind of take that as an initial premise, and then show the problems that occur because somebody's unwilling to accept their reality as it currently is. And if they had just accepted the way things were, it would have gone better for them. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think just to kind of like go back to something you touched on there, like I think one thing that you kind of need to factor into the equation when talking about like deceptions feels too heavy a word, because as you say, we're all kind of presenting a version of ourselves on social media, and it's kind of built into the platforms, and it's almost encouraged by the platforms. You're supposed to sort of share the sort of brightest parts of yourself.
Yeah, it's so weird. I mean, it's like it's a hard thing to even understand. I mean, anytime you post something, you're like, is this the kind of person I am? Should I post this thing? Like it involves this weird extra step of like how we're choosing to represent ourselves. I mean, prior to media, it was like, yeah, it's a performance. Exactly. Like prior to that, it's like, what clothes am I wearing today? What does my hair look like? Like how am I presenting to the world? But this is like another narrative layer of, hey, this is how I want to be seen. But I don't know. None of us really, there's not an answer to the question, who am I? We're all just constantly inventing that as we go. And some of us are just more bought into the answer we've come up with than others. Yeah, I again, these are all just like things that I think about and I think found their way into the film in some way or another. I think the hard work of writing a script comes down to like having these esoteric ideas and beliefs and then making them narratively compelling to an audience that doesn't want to just hear you ramble about your perspectives on social media and connection and loneliness. Like, it's like, how do you make it entertaining and emotional and not just esoteric and intellectualized?
Well, that's the thing. It's not like a lecture on social media or the dangers of being catfished, if you like, because I don't know. My interpretation, James, of the film was that like it's rooted in such pathos, and it's rooted in like this quiet emotionality. This character Franklin, like it's not a case of he's being deceived and he's being tricked. There's a certain kind of two-way street aspect to it where I think there's a longing on his part to be wanted by the seemingly most perfect person on the other end of the broadband connection. And it's such a strong feeling, that desire to be wanted and to meet someone else and connect with them, that like it makes him kind of park logic and ignore some of the red flags. And that to me is like, that's the kind of like heartbreaking thing about this film and the really moving thing about this film. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's a good sort of segue into the script itself, and yeah, kind of like how you arrived at this very emotional finished version of the film, very funny, very dark, very compelling finished version of the film. So the story, as I have it, it kind of dates back to 2015 and this script first date, which was a story that happened to you, and elements of it would end up in I Love My Dad, but it was a very different story. Can you talk us through it?
Yeah, so when I was probably 13 or 14, I met a girl at summer camp, and she and I stayed in touch via instant messenger. My instant messenger name was Bust Mauve, short for Bust a Move, from the song Just Bust a Move, which I loved from the movie Dude, Where's My Car? So for some reason, I was very attracted to that name as a screen name. And her name on AIM was Hot Mama Goose. And we would talk about we would like instant message back and forth about the idea of us kissing, and because we never did, but we both really wanted to French kiss. But she lived in New Jersey, and I lived outside of Boston. My dad, I told my dad about this, and he volunteered to drive me all the way to New Jersey to go see a movie with her, and hopefully get the chance to kiss. And so she and I organized basically like, I mean, I guess you could call it like a play date, but my dad drove me all the way to New Jersey. It's like a 6 or 7 hour drive, and took us to go see Harry Potter. And I remember like sitting next to her the whole time, and I couldn't work up the courage to kiss her. I just was like looking at her face and looking away. And then he drove her home, dropped her off, and we drove all the way back home. And so I just thought, and in the story, his character, or the father character, is like struggling with intimacy in his own relationship. And I was interested in like the lengths someone will go to repair a relationship in some ways, but then their lack of willingness to do the same thing in other parts of their lives. So that I wrote that movie, and then when I came up with I Love My Dad, this idea of which again, something that came out of an experience I had with my dad, I realized, oh, this idea of a father driving their son very far so that they can realize this connection they think they have, that could actually go into I Love My Dad and be the second half of the movie. And so I kind of scavenged that whole story of this of that script First Date and put it into I Love My Dad as the second half. So it's just interesting that you really never know what's going to happen with the narratives you work on. And if I had never written that script, I don't know if it would have made its way into I Love My Dad, or if I would have ever made I Love My Dad, really. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I really try to hold myself to this idea that I don't control the results of my work. I don't necessarily control if my work is good or not, but I do control the volume of my output. And so I try to keep that high so that not everything needs to work. But if 1 in 5 movies I write works, then I need to write 5 movies so that fifth can work.
Yeah, I think I remember you saying, I forget which book it was, but there was an interview years ago where you talked about reading a book that said 9 out of 10 businesses fail. So you just have to create 10 businesses, and that being a philosophy that you tend to apply to everything.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Yeah. 9 out of 10 businesses fail. So you got to create 10 businesses. And I look at that for every area of my life, really, is like, well, 9 out of 10 times it's not going to work out. So you've got to try 10 times. And I look at that when I'm writing a scene. I just try to focus on quantity, and then I let my instinct guide me toward like, oh, I like this one the most. But like just generating tons and tons and tons of options and pathways has been useful to me in terms of just not feeling overly precious about any particular direction. The first draft of I Love My Dad, which I sent you, and I've only sent it to one other person. It was Claudia from I Love My Dad.
Who plays Becca.
Yeah. A weird thing about Claudia that I haven't talked about is that my dad's name is Claudio. But that's beside the point. Anyway, I sent her the first draft. And in the first draft, I'm basically like, when I'm writing a first draft of something, I'm trying to be as unhinged as I possibly can be. I'm trying to just like allow myself to be messy and not make sense and just be like kind of a mess on the page. I'm like writing stuff in there that I would never want to show anybody, and I'm almost trying to show myself through how bad that first draft is, like that you have permission to be a total mess and anything goes in that first pass. Now that process is iterative. I'll have a sense of the structure, so I'll have an outline prior to doing that first pass, and then I'll like go off the rails with that first pass, and then I'll like re-outline from that first pass, and then I'll basically like just do that again over and over and over. And I'll, and there's a couple weeks in between each of those attempts, and and sometimes a lot longer, and you get I don't know, I get kind of an intuitive sense of like, oh, this part of the story is really resonating with me, and then this other part feels more intellectualized, or like for whatever reason isn't coming from my gut, and I just don't understand it or see it as clearly. And so it's like I don't know. I mean, I feel like that first draft is all about just like getting the clay out that I'm going to be working with for the rest of the movie.
So when you talk about trying to be unhinged in your first pass at a script, James, then going through a process of generating different pathways, different ways the story could play out, can you talk to me about your first attempt at I Love My Dad, which was then titled Age, Sex, Location? Like what were some of the pathways you explored in that version and in other iterative versions of this story as you tried to kind of get the calibration right of empathy, making sure the audience cared about Chuck, even though what he's doing is kind of not great?
Several things come to mind, one of which is that there was a customer service person that Chuck connects to in the beginning of the movie, and that person ends up being the Becca whose profile he replicates in order to become Franklin's friend online, and then Franklin ends up falling for this person, and then this person had a second job as a waitress at a diner, and that felt kind of convoluted that she was like a customer service person and also worked at the diner, so I didn't do that. And there was another whole ending that existed beforehand where Chuck has a heart attack at the diner, and then through that heart attack, Franklin connects in a more authentic way with the real Becca, and that so in a way Chuck's deception actually works because he got Franklin close to this actual person. I realized that wasn't the point of the movie because this real Becca is just some random person. And it doesn't matter whether Franklin is connecting with this random person or not, because it's not about the romantic love he was experiencing. It was like he was experiencing a connection to this other person who was his dad. It just wasn't, he was connecting just the human underneath the representation of this person. So those were a couple different pathways. I haven't read that version in a long time, but going back to this idea of being unhinged in the writing, I kind of feel like, I mean, being a filmmaker is a weird thing because you kind of have to try to like tap into this like kind of unconscious part of yourself that's visceral and messy and super honest. And then you have to position it in a way to a bunch of collaborators and then also audiences that feels a little bit more buttoned up. And when you're working on something, it's just a different, I find that it's a different mode than when you're talking about the thing. And so that's been a process, as I'm doing a lot of press for I Love My Dad and talking about the movie a lot, it's just such a different part of my brain than the part of me that's actually willing to go there and write and not be polite. And so I don't know, when I'm writing, I try to I sometimes try to isolate because I'm like basically giving myself permission to like go off the rails a little bit. I find that that's the energy I'm attracted to in storytelling, where it feels dangerous and it feels like there's an aliveness to it. I don't want to watch somebody that has media training doing writing a first draft of a script, or writing a script at all for that matter. Like I'm not interested in like the buttoned up version of an artist or a creative. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so that's more to say, like, energetically, that's how I'm trying to come to the table with my work. And I had someone once tell me, you wear 4 different hats when you write. You can't wear any of them at the same time. First hat is madman, where you're just totally just going for it and you're crazy. You just get it all out. I don't know if I'm going to get these hats right, but I'm going to do my best. Second, I think, was carpenter. Or no, sorry. Second was architect, where you're going in and you're like looking at kind of the general structure of the thing and what the madman did on their first go round. And then the third is carpenter, where you're kind of evening the edges of things and fixing what's there. And then fourth is judge. And you only put the judge hat on when those other 3 have gotten their chance to go in and do their thing. And that's where you go, is this actually working? Like, is this actually resonating? It's the part of me that will share my work with other people and ask for really pointed feedback and kind of test the work to see is the feeling I initially had recognizable in the work as it is now. And then it's just a matter of iterating and going through those steps again and again and again.
And tell me, I can imagine there must have been such a eureka feeling when you cracked on the page how you were going to approach the movie visually. Like, there's a brilliant visual device in the film that allows Becca, or rather the kind of fictionalized Becca, who's actually Chuck, it allows her to come to life and sit next to Franklin and engage with him. It excuses the movie from being 90 minutes of watching people on their phones. The playfulness of that device, you really push and push. There's a bunch of great scenes in this in which, like, that physical approximation of Becca is talking nonsense in the car with Franklin because Chuck is mistyping, and it becomes like a source of comedy, the visual device. But on the other end of the tonal spectrum, it's also the source of these devastating moments. And probably the most devastating is the pool sequence when Becca walks on water. It's this reminder that she's not actually there, and it arrives at this real low point for Franklin. I'd love to zero in on that scene, James, and just hear a little bit about like how you came up with the pool scene and the degree to which it was hard to write, because it's quite a hard scene to watch.
So this idea of Becca walking out onto the pool, I guess I saw it as like she's going somewhere where he can't follow, like she's going away. And there was something about her walking onto this like dirty pool in this kind of rundown apartment complex and then disappearing into the water. That whole sequence came pretty late in the process for me. And yeah, which is something I have to constantly remind myself of. Sometimes I'll compare my initial efforts to finished work, and it's not fair to do to oneself, because these things take so many passes and so many layers of effort. So things like her speaking typos, that came very late in the writing process, and her walking on water came very late in the writing process, and also was kind of something that, as I was getting more into prep, it was like, okay, I'm gonna have this location. Then I was like, oh, I can make use of the pool in this way, and then everything kind of uh, concretizes around these other elements. But yeah, in terms of pulling from real experience, I mean, I don't know. I guess I was thinking about it in terms of like how hard it is to either be broken up with or break up with someone else, because you're witnessing that moment from two different perspectives. You're experiencing it from Franklin's perspective, who's being broken up with and is trying to grapple with uh, this other person who is not making any sense. And then you're watching Chuck trying to let his son down, and is trying to basically end what he started by breaking up with him, but by not breaking his heart, and by trying to let him down easy. And so there was something about like there was something weirdly poignant to me about Becca saying all of this nonsense that she's, she has to move to California or maybe Japan, or like that she's just frantically searching for this excuse for why she can't be with him. And an image that was in my mind as I was writing that scene was like the idea of like having to like one of the most heartbreaking scenes I've ever seen in a movie. I think it's in Air Bud. It's this part where he's like telling his dog, I think it's Air Bud, it might be Homeward Bound or something, but he's telling his dog to get lost, and he's like, go, just like go away. And he's like forcing his dog to run away. And that was the feeling I was after, was just this feeling of like trying to end it with something you love, even though it's killing you.
Where we go from there and how that sets up the end of the film, James, is kind of remarkable. You mentioned earlier that there were so many different endings of the film that you explored as you kind of, did pass after pass at the script. At one point, you kind of considered putting Franklin together with the real life Becca before realizing that this is a film about a father and a son. So that's the relationship that has to be focused on in terms of a resolution. Can you talk to me about the ending and what was wrong about all those other iterations that felt right about this conclusion to the story?
I think something that fascinates me is this idea that um, that you can love somebody and that it transcends the specific of familial or romantic or any other kind of categorization of love, but that you can like you can end up like really seeing somebody and loving them in a way that transcends all these other categorizations. So I think I was chasing this idea of these two people who really find out about one another and get to know one another, even though they're lying about who they are through that process. That fascinates me, that we can connect sometimes more easily through wearing a mask, that it makes us feel more comfortable in getting to be known by another person. So that was one component of it. And then I guess the other was this idea that in many ways we become our parents. So it was important to me that, Franklin has learned like Chuck has this limited set of tools that he's working with in order to connect with the people in his life, one of which is tremendous dishonesty. And through the process of going on this whole journey, Franklin kind of realizes, oh, I'm dishonest too. And so I need to forgive my dad because it's not all black and white. It's like he's not necessarily an evil person just because he has this one thing wrong with him. And there was kind of like a weird meta significance to the whole to that theme in the idea of making this movie. And I almost feel like in a way I was going through a similar journey as the creator of the piece. The movie starts with "this actually happened," and it's like poetically, a lot of it, some of it actually happened, but a lot of it I took a lot of poetic license with. So in a way, I feel like I'm lying and I'm being dishonest. And this whole movie was almost like a way of being more real than I would have otherwise if I were to just state the literal facts of exactly what happened. And so that was resonant to me as well. I mean, I'm using my home video footage. I'm using all these details of things that actually occurred, but then I'm also infusing a lot of narrative devices and things to heighten and things to subvert. But yeah, in doing so, it feels like I'm able to express the feeling a lot more clearly than I otherwise would have been able to. And I think at the end, Franklin is kind of able to do the same.
Yeah, yeah. And let me ask you something else I've been wondering about. I asked you at the top of the conversation, James, about the catharsis that the film brought you. If you don't mind me asking, like, what was the catharsis like in terms of what it brought your dad? Like, have you spoken to him about how the film perhaps lent him some forgiveness or some acceptance for how he behaved? Like, what's the current state of play in terms of his reaction to the film and how the empathy that the movie extends towards him maybe allowed him a kind of lighter perspective on what happened in real life between you guys?
It's really interesting. I mean, I think so many of these conversations are happening non-verbally more than anything else. And for me, the biggest thing my dad did was like be kind of in on the joke of the movie and not fight against the movie. That to me was the most meaningful thing. He's kind of one of the most meaningful things he ever did for me. And early on in the process, when he knew this movie was going to be released worldwide, was he said, I don't care how this movie makes me look because you're getting to do this thing that you've always wanted to do. Uh, and there was like a degree of martyrdom in that, but there was also this kind of self-sacrifice that you don't see in Chuck necessarily until the very end. And I guess that's the most relevant kind of conversation or moment that still really sticks with me. Um, and it basically being able to like laugh at life and just kind of have a sense of humor about the absurdity of different parts of life. I mean, my interest in filmmaking really came from my dad as a little kid. He would take me to go see movies every weekend, and he gave me a video camera, and he was often I would tell him where to point the camera, and I would act in things and direct him as I was telling little stories. And so in a weird way, the release of this movie felt very full circle. Yeah, really just kind of I was kind of blown away by his reaction to all of it, in that he was able to be so gracious.
And is there a takeaway that you had from the experience making this movie, James, around the value of not burying or running from the episodes in our lives that are painful or that bring initially a sense of shame, even if that sense of shame is unwarranted? Like, a lot of people who underwent this experience with their father might never have told another soul. You told the whole world. You put it up on a giant movie screen. What did the film reaffirm for you in terms of like how stories like that are rooted in the parts of ourselves we instinctively want to hide, that's where the realist storytelling is. That's where the most gripping storytelling is found.
Yeah, it's a complicated question because I think ultimately, I mean, it's a tricky balancing act because like I feel like I'm beholden to a feeling of creative appetite I have from within me. Like if I'm not satisfying that, then I'm not super clear why I'm making stuff at all or telling stories. But then I also feel like I'm not just doing that for its own sake. I'm not just writing, I'm not just telling stories so that I can hear myself tell them. They need to be connecting with other people. And in order to do that, it needs to be compelling and entertaining. And so whether or not this story, like this the movie needs to stand on its own whether or not it happened. And it doesn't matter how much of it happened or how much of it didn't. The fact that some of it happened, I think, makes the viewing experience more compelling and adds a level of mystery and intrigue to the whole thing. But ultimately, it needs to work either way. And vulnerability, I think vulnerability and I was going to say vulnerability and honesty go hand in hand, but I don't think they necessarily do. I think you can be vulnerable by using artifice and expressing things similar to what we were talking about earlier with this idea of like wearing a mask. Sometimes by framing your story or heightening it in certain ways or using metaphor or kind of putting the story in an adjacent context, we're almost more able to express ourselves. So I think I don't know. I think it's like, I don't know. I don't know if I have any particular advice other than like, I think it's really important to know who you are, uh, and, and, uh, and be connected to your feelings as a storyteller, because that's ultimately what you're trying to communicate to other people.
Yeah, that's a really, really beautiful place to leave it, James. Before I let you go, can I ask what's coming up from you? Like, have you got your next project set up? And yeah, what sort of stories would you like to explore in the future? Having now shared this really personal part of yourself, what stories that perhaps do lean into more artifice, as you put it, are you excited to be telling coming up?
Yeah, I got hired to write a few different things, and I'll be directing those things as well. I'm really excited about those. I wrote a movie last year that was on the blacklist this year called Pop, and that's about this lonely little boy who blackmails his favorite pop star into being his best friend. Kind of feels like a little kid Nightcrawler in the world of A Star Is Born, or kind of like a really fucked up Almost Famous. It's gonna be like really splashy and weird and fun. It's got like that king of comedy kind of like desperation to connect with someone. I'm really excited about that movie. I'm casting it right now, and hope to make it later this year. But yeah, man, I mean, I feel like every day I'm just kind of showing up and trying to kind of, I guess, chase the rabbit of my enthusiasm.
I love it, man. Well, yeah, James, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for coming on Script Apart, man.
Oh, thank you so much, Al. It's great to see you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.